Hi Form 5A. So of course, this is our very first e-lesson, and I'm excited to see how this is going to work. And so basically in this video, I'm just going to talk very quickly about what a private enterprise is, the different types of private enterprises. And I'm going to focus actually a lot on limited companies because of course we've already spoken about sole proprietorships and general partnerships, and I will put the Quizlet questions we did last Thursday on Google Classrooms, and I think last Tuesday we filled out a chart comparing sole proprietorships and general partnerships, and you should have written that in your notebooks. So anyway, what is a private enterprise? Now, a private enterprise is just a company that is started, created, and owned by a few business people or entrepreneurs. So as long as you have enough money, or what we call capital, and a very good business plan, so if you can produce a good, or if you can provide a service that citizens need and they really like, then you can actually make a lot of money. And that's another good thing about private enterprises, is that they are for profit. There's no limit to the amount of money or profit that you can earn. Now, this is a good thing also if we think about employees, because employees now, they're going to work harder. They're going to have motivation or incentive to be productive, because the more units of good they produce, then the higher their wages or their salary will be. So of course, this is a great thing for private enterprises. Now, what is not so good about a private enterprise? What is a disadvantage? Well, unfortunately, not everyone can afford to buy a good or a service from private enterprises. So if you think about a MacBook, billions of people around the world would love to have a MacBook, but they can't afford to buy it because it's so expensive. And so instead, they might just use a PC in the library or in school, or they might just buy a cheaper laptop brand instead. So of course, if we think about public enterprises, this is different, because goods and services from public enterprises are at much lower prices, or even for free. So if you think about a public hospital or a public school, these services are for free that citizens can enjoy. So there are three types of private enterprises, right? So there's sole proprietorships, general partnerships, and limited companies. So very quickly, a sole proprietorship just has one owner. And a general partnership must have at least two owners. And you can have up to 50 owners in a general partnership. But really, we're going to spend a lot of time looking at limited companies, which we haven't learned about or discussed before. So, a limited company, first of all, must have at least one owner, or what we call a shareholder. Now, this is very important, because a shareholder is someone who owns a percentage of a limited company. Now, a share is a percentage of a company. For example, Steve Jobs, or no, not Steve Jobs, let's say Bill Gates, okay? Because Bill Gates is still alive. Now, Bill Gates, he owns, let's say, 90% of Microsoft shares. That means he owns 90% of the company. He is the biggest shareholder because he owns the most shares or stocks. It means the same thing, shares and stocks. So don't get confused between shares and stocks. So if we look at an example, Now, McDonald's is a limited company, and it has 100 shares. And in total, there are 10 shareholders. So what that means is each shareholder will own 10% of McDonald's. So that's what a shareholder is. A shareholder is an owner who owns X percent of a company, of a limited company, I should say. All right. So in a limited company, shareholders only bear limited liability. Now this is a big difference because in a sole proprietorship or a general partnership, if you owed, let's say, $1 million to the bank and you only have 500,000 in your bank account to pay, then what does BCM do? Because of course BCM came yesterday. So what would BCM do to get the remaining 500,000? Well, BCM would take your house, your car, and all of your other valuable assets, the things that you own, until the 500,000 is paid for or covered. So that is what we call unlimited liability, is when the bank can take however much of your assets it wants or it feels like is enough. But if you are a shareholder of a limited company, then this is actually much better, because what happens is if the limited company owes money to the bank or to anyone, then you're only liable to the amount that you invested. So what that means is the amount of money I paid to buy X number of shares for X dollars, that is my liability. So if we look at this example right here, if a limited company owes $500,000 to the bank and I own 5% of company shares, so I own 5% of this company, then my liability, my limited liability, is just going to be 5% of 500,000 or 25,000. So of course, 25,000 limited liability. Well, that's much better than BCM taking away everything I own. And so I would be left with nothing if I were a sole proprietor or a general partner. But as a shareholder of a limited company, my risk is much lower. So a very good thing, for sure. So the next thing is management structure. So this is quite simple. And so all you need to know is that in a limited company, the owners are called shareholders. And shareholders are just people who buy shares or stocks of a company. And shares or stocks are just a percentage of a company. So the more shares you buy, the more shares you own, the higher percentage of the company, of the limited company, you own. And so if shareholders are the owners, then they also have power. And what is this power? As a shareholder, even if you own 1% of Taobao, then you have the power to choose the board of directors. So of course, we discussed board of directors when we were looking at public corporations. So public corporation is just a company that is started by the government, but then the government chooses a group of managers to look after the employees, to make sure they are not being lazy or that they are not wasting the company's resources. So this is the responsibility of the board of directors, and the board of directors is chosen by the government. So similarly, in a limited company, the board of directors, a group of managers, again, to monitor the employees, are chosen by us, the shareholders. It doesn't matter how much percent of a limited company you own, you still have the right, the power to vote or to choose a board of directors. And this will usually happen once a year. And so, of course, maybe the board of directors with the most votes will be chosen. So that is management structure. All right, lasting continuity in limited companies. Now this is quite different compared to the other private enterprises, um, like sole proprietorships and general partnerships. Why? Because if you're a sole proprietor, for example, I own a sunglasses company, and if I die tomorrow, then my sunglasses company will also finish. It will end. Unless I decide to transfer my company to my girlfriend or to someone else, so that even if I die, the company won't die. So usually, the sole proprietorships and general partnerships do not have lasting continuity. If the owner dies, or if one of the owners die, then the business also dies. But if we are talking about a limited company, there is lasting continuity. So even if Steve Jobs, who's already died, is no longer here, Apple is still here because it's a limited company. Apple now has a new CEO. It still releases and sells new products every year. And so that's what we mean by lasting continuity. Even if one of the owners die, the limited company itself will still continue. Alright, so next is higher profit tax rates. Now I know this is something that I didn't teach you earlier on, but what all this is saying is, if you are a private enterprise and you earn profit, then every month or every year or every period, the government will make you pay X% of your profit in taxes. So generally, in a general partnership or a sole proprietorship, the tax rate is much lower. But in a limited company, the tax rate is much higher. So if you look at this example right here, sole proprietorship, general partnership, tax rate is 10%. And so again, if we talk about my sunglasses company, and last month I made $300,000. Now my tax would be 10% times 300,000, which is 30,000. That is my tax cost or tax expense. That's how much the government will collect in taxes from me. Now, if we talk about a limited company, like, for example, let's say Versace. Now Versace made $3 million in profit last month, but they have to pay 20% in taxes. And so their tax cost, their tax expense is going to be $6 million, which is much, much higher. So we already know that public enterprises are paid for or funded by taxes. So actually, those taxes are not just coming from us citizens. They're also coming from private enterprises. Most of the taxes actually are coming from casinos, especially here in Macau. They're coming from Wynn Palace, Venetian, Parisian, etc. That's where most of the taxes are coming from. And those same taxes are being used to pay employees in public enterprises like public doctors, policemen, firefighters, etc. Okay. So another thing about limited companies is sources of capital. And I'm actually going to talk about this in a separate video because it will take a little bit of time to explain this. But the idea is, if you are a limited company and you're growing, so like let's say you are Wynn Resorts and you want to build another casino, then you need to think, okay, where am I going to get more money, more capital to buy land, to build a new casino, to hire more labor or employees? So that's when we think about sources of capital. That means, how will I get more money? And I will talk about that, of course, in another video. So those are just limited companies in general. And in real life, we have two types of limited companies. We have private limited companies, or PLCs, and we also have public limited companies, or LTDs. So let's look at PLCs, private limited companies, first. So the first thing to know is that a private limited company can only have between 1 and 50 shareholders. So actually, in this way, it's a little bit similar to a general partnership. A general partnership, you can have up to 50 shareholders. So it's a much smaller group of owners or shareholders, people who can buy shares or stocks of limited company. Now, what else? If you want to transfer shares that belong to a private limited company, then you need permission or approval from the other shareholders. Now, let's say I own 20% of shares in a private limited company. Now, actually, in the real world, there aren't too many private limited companies. Or at least you don't hear about them in the news, or you don't, people don't actually know too much about these types of companies, unless maybe, you live in a city and you may know someone who works or owns shares in a private limited company. So, for example, if I want to transfer 10% of Planck PLC stock to my bro, then what I need to do is I need to ask the other 49 owner. So I have no freedom. And again, this is a little bit similar to a general partnership. If you remember, in a general partnership, I cannot make decisions with 100% freedom. I always have to discuss ideas with the other shareholders. If I want to transfer shares, I need to get permission or approval from the other shareholders. So if you think about it, private limited company is actually very, very similar to a general partnership. Now, what else? Shares cannot be sold in the public market. Now, what this means is, if I want to sell my shares or my stocks, I cannot do that in public. I can only do that in private. So what do I mean by not listed? So in the world, we have several very important public markets. And in these public markets, you can buy shares or stock of the biggest companies in the world. So the biggest public markets are in Hong Kong, in New York, and in London. And so, of course, all the US companies will be listed on the US public market or the US stock exchange. Google, Microsoft, GoPro, Apple, all of these companies will be on the US public market. But if you're a PLC, if you're a private limited company, you're not going to be on the public market. You're not going to be listed. Now, Apple is listed on the US public market, on the US stock exchange. So that's what it means by not being a listed company. So, if I did want to so it is still possible for me to sell private limited company shares or stock. How? I have two options. So my first option is I can sell it to another shareholder. I can sell it to any one of the other 49 shareholders. And I can do this with more freedom. Or I could sell my shares to family or friends, but I would have to get the permission or the approval of the other 49 owners or shareholders. So that's all there is to private limited companies. So then, of course, we have public limited companies, or which are also known as LTDs. So these are the biggest companies in the world. So these are the Nikes and the Adidases, the Pumas, the Apples, the Samsungs, all the biggest brands, all the biggest companies that we know and that we hear about every day in the news. So what's true about LTDs, or public limited companies? Well, there can be an unlimited number of shareholders. So any one of us, as long as we have enough capital, enough money to invest or to buy in shares, we can be owners of the biggest private enterprises in the world. So if I want to be one of to be one of the new owners of Snapchat, for example, I can buy Snapchat shares in the public market, and I become a new shareholder, a new owner, and there can be billions of shareholders. Anyone who has enough capital or money can be a shareholder of an LTD or a public limited company. So that's a big difference. So another thing is, if you are a shareholder of an LTD, then you can transfer your shares freely. If I want to transfer my shares to my let's say to my parents, I can do that without having to ask any of the other owners or shareholders. I can do it whenever I want. So, for example, let's look at Alibaba. Now the CEO, of course, is Jack Ma, and he owns most of the shares. He's the largest shareholder. So he can transfer 90% of his Alibaba shares or stock to his son, Jackson. Now, of course, his son isn't named Jackson. Just kidding. So that's how it is. You have freedom to transfer your shares. Now, one more thing about LTDs is that they can be sold in the public market. So as I was saying, for private limited companies, PLCs, these companies are not listed in the public market. You cannot buy shares from a private limited company unless someone you know is a shareholder, or you happen to be one of the shareholders. Otherwise, you can't buy stock. It's impossible. You can't buy shares. But for a public limited company, an LTD, it's completely different. You can just go to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, or the New York Stock Exchange, or the mainland China Stock Exchange, and you can see a list of all the companies, all the big companies on that public market, and you can decide to buy shares, however many shares, for any of the companies that are listed. So that's what it means. A listed company is just an LTD, a public limited company that is included in a public market. So like I said, several public markets in the world: New York, London, Shanghai, Hong Kong. And so maybe Alibaba is going to be on the Shanghai Stock Exchange. If you want to be an owner, a shareholder of Alibaba, you just have to go on the Shanghai public market, the Shanghai Stock Exchange, and on the list of companies you will see Alibaba. So Alibaba is a listed company on the Shanghai public market or stock exchange. So again, just an example. If I want, I can sell 5% of my Google shares on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange market. Well, I don't know, maybe this is not true. Maybe Google might be on the US stock exchange market. But let's say, for example, it really is in the Hong Kong public market. Then I can do that. And so if I sell, of course, someone will buy it from me, someone with enough capital, enough money. Now, maybe tomorrow, right? Or in the future, if you want to invest or buy in stocks, you can just go to a public market, one of the public markets in the world, and you can buy shares for any one of the listed companies, the companies that are included in that stock exchange, in that public market. So that's what public limited companies look like. So just to review very quickly, limited companies must have at least 2 shareholders. There's lasting continuity. So if any of the owners die or any of the shareholders die, no problem. Limited company will still continue. And then we have private limited companies that can only have up to 50 shareholders. If you want to transfer your shares, you need permission. You need to ask the other 49 shareholders. And you cannot sell your shares in the public market. You can only sell it to another shareholder in private, or you can sell it to a friend or a family member, but you can only do that once you have permission or approval from the other 49 shareholders. And then for a public limited company, unlimited number of shareholders. Any one of us, if we have enough capital, can invest or buy shares and be an owner. We can transfer our shares very freely, and we can sell our shares on the public market, or what we call a stock exchange market. And there's several of them in the world, like in Hong Kong, Shanghai, New York, and London.